Well, where we left off as we were last together, me having been away last Sunday, we were in 2 Thessalonians, and I'm going to read in chapter 1, verse 11 and 12, the last two verses before we'll enter chapter 2, and it said this: "To this end, we also pray for you always, that our God will count you worthy of your calling and fulfill every desire for goodness and the work of faith with power, so that the name of our Lord Jesus will be glorified in you and you in him, according to the grace of our God and the Lord Jesus Christ." As we read those words together, we left off talking about the note in which that God is calling us and his longing to fulfill every desire for goodness and the work of faith with power. That is, that God was instilling in our hearts good works prepared beforehand that he wanted to fulfill. God had not only called, but was working on our behalf, wanted to work on and in his glory's behalf. He was the one. Faithful is he who calls you and will do it or bring it to pass. As we looked at those words and as we talked this morning and as we've been praying about some of these issues, I often come to that question: how do you get to the place where you know the name of the Lord, you represent the Lord, and yet, as we've been discussing this morning, you get to a place where you can do these things that are so far from the Lord? There's no mistaking that, as we were mentioning, that there's things that man does in the Lord's name. The Lord has nothing to do with it. How do you get to that place? There's a moment where if we become misguided, we forget and we go from God calling and doing to what I am going to do for God. It's a quick switch and a flip where I forget that the work of Christ is a work of faith, a work that God is accomplishing in and through us. And the moment I lose sight of the source who not only calls, but wants to complete the work that he's prepared, now the pressure's on to do for God what all along God wants and has wanted to do for you and I. And we can look back at history and see a world in which so many make the flip and stop relying on something that God is going to do for you and I, and begin thinking that the pressure is on for you and I to do for God. And now we have all kinds of misguided directions in trying to accomplish God's will, right? We look back and you think of Abraham. Again, you all know, one of my favorite characters, because we see God using a man in his absolute weakness, right? And despite him fulfilling, faithful to every promise, right? The moment God promises a son, and Abraham turns, and after having waited and seeing no son yet, decides to sleep with his maidservant in order to create a son and offer to God what God had promised and offered to give him, right? That created conflict. It created hurt. It created, right? That maidservant was later abused and rejected. The son would be one who would be at war with his brothers perpetually, it said. I mean, on go the consequences. And when God came again to say, Abram, I've come to fulfill my promises. Oh, that Ishmael might live before thee, right? God, I've already got one. Don't bother. I did it, right? Go back through history where people, believing they were faithful to the Lord, and began trying to accomplish the Lord's work. You look back at the Crusades again, right? We're going to go in, and anyone who's not God's, we're going to wipe them out, right? We're going to cleanse with the sword. Was that God's way? Probably one of the most challenging biographies. I tell you, I've read it, but I'm not a prolific reader. I listen to it. Audiobooks are my friend when I'm driving on the tractor these days. You know what? Not one more challenging biography than the biography of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. If you haven't heard of him, he was a theologian who was born in 1906 and he died in 1945. He was German born. He became an outspoken critic and a leader in what was called in Germany at the time of the Second World War, the Confessing Church. They called it the Confessing Church because they had to separate themselves from the state church. Because the state church, Hitler was incredible in how he manipulated and made it as though this was a Christian endeavor, and much of the church supported his work, his theories, and his theologies. It was the Confessing Church that stood up and said, no, this isn't right. And after spending a good deal of time in England, speaking, preaching, and having the freedom to write in England at a seminary, he eventually went back to Germany and found himself caught up in an assassination plot for Hitler. Not only was he outspoken as a church member, but later on, the plot would be revealed. And if there's any idea that God is in control and allows his people to rise and to fall, they actually got a briefcase into a bunker room where Hitler had a meeting. And when the bomb went off, they had moved the briefcase and he was sitting on the other side of an oak table that was so sturdy, it absorbed 4 people died and he lived. Isn't that incredible? You just think at any time, well, for Hitler, that bolstered his confidence that he was divinely appointed and went even on with more fervor, right? But at the right time, he would be taken down. He would be taken out. Well, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, for criticizing, he would be imprisoned, where he became a minister, and much of what we read of his writing, letters he wrote as he ministered to fellow prison mates in Germany. He was later taken to a concentration camp where I think 3 days before the Allies came in, he was executed. Sad story, right? But what a conundrum of faith. Walking in a time of great conflict, church members supporting, confessing church members rejecting, and all this going on in a walk of faith before a holy Father. And I'm looking at today, and why am I sharing all that? Because if there's anything as we proceed this morning, if there's any one thing I could hone in on, or I hope you can take away, it's our need to cling to our Heavenly Father with faith and listen to his every command. We left off last week when I was with you talking about cultivate faithfulness, right? And he will fulfill every desire of your heart. Those desires we spoke of, he puts and places there as we begin to take on the heart of God. But without knowing the commands of God, we will not be faithful to God in the obedience we long for. And as we read this morning, I want to just paint the picture and give that reminder that today more than ever, we need to be listening for the voice of the Good Shepherd. Listen to what it goes on to say. And in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 1, we've read these verses already because we had used them when we were looking at some of the words we read in 1 Thessalonians. But it says this, 2 Thessalonians 2 and verse 1, we request you, brethren, with regard to the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our gathering together to him, that you not be quickly shaken from your composure or be disturbed, either by a spirit or a message or a letter, as if from us, to the effect that the day of the Lord has come. Now, I want to stop there because Paul wants to make sure that they are not quickly shaken from composure or disturbed. It is so easy in times like these to get shaken from your composure, disturbed or distracted from what we're here for. And I'm going to give an example of that in a moment. But Paul wants to be sure that they are not quickly shaken from their composure or disturbed or distracted, as though things were not or had already been that hadn't yet come to pass. He goes on and says this in 2 Thessalonians 2 and verse 3. Let no one in any way deceive you, for it will not come unless the apostasy comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, displaying himself as being God. Do you not remember that while I was still with you, I was telling you these things? And you know what restrains him now, so that in his time he will be revealed. For the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. Only he who now restrains will do so until he's taken out of the way. Then that lawless one will be revealed, from whom the Lord will slay with the breath of his mouth and bring to an end by the appearance of his coming. That is the one who's coming in accordance with the activity of Satan, with all power and signs and false wonders, and with all the deception of wickedness for those who perish because they did not receive the love of the truth so as to be saved. You see, as we read, Paul wants to be sure that they will not be quickly shaken, nor lose their composure, nor think that Jesus has already come. And he reminds them of what is yet to happen that will lead up to the coming of the Lord. And that is the revealing of the lawless one, the son of destruction. This is the end time as the Lord prepares the return. We spoke when we were in 1 Thessalonians of the rapture and the taking up of the believers. That word apostasy in verse 3, which can mean both a falling away and a collecting, a taking up. But it says what restrains him now, so that in his time he will be revealed. The mystery of the lawlessness is already at work. And this is what's important today, is that as we press on and press forward, the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. We live in these times, the end times. And as I've mentioned, when the disciples said the time is near, as Paul wrote, how much more near now? And as we look to the Lord, we are going to be in a time of diluting influence. 2 Thessalonians verse 11, diluting influence. People believing what's false. We're going to be in a time where there are going to be wonders and powers and dark things coming in the image of that which is light. But how do we keep our composure or keep from being disturbed or distracted? How do you find yourself ending up in a church supporting the movement of the Nazis and not detracting? How do you find yourself in the name of the Lord uncovering unthinkable abuse? What should be being uncovered is unthinkable love, right? It comes when we begin to believe in falsehood. One of those falsehoods, what I need to do for God. And I try to achieve God's things by my own human measures, right? Hitler was going to cleanse the earth. We're going to do it this way or that way, or whatever the motive was. And we can't get into in and every motive. But as we walk, here's what's so important, because I'm going to name for you a way in which I find, and I'm going to say me, and it can be we as a church can get distracted. Today, as we live in these end times, and when I think about that, it should not surprise us where the world is going. right? The destruction, the deception is going to increase as the time gets nearer. The falling away, as we get closer, that's where the world is going. You know, we could read again, which I know we did when we were in First Thessalonians, but in Revelation 13, I'll only remind you for time's sake this morning. It tells us that this one whom Second Thessalonians speaks of is going to rise up, and he's going to make war with the saints and to overcome them. And he's going to have authority over every tribe and people and tongue. And people will worship him. And it will go on, and it tells us in Revelation 13 that it says that another is going to rise, and he will exercise all the authority of the first beast and his presence. He will make the earth and those who dwell in it worship the first beast, and the fatal wound was healed. He's going to perform great signs so that he even makes fire come down out of heaven and to the earth and the presence of men, and deceives those who dwell on the earth because of the signs which it was given to him to perform in the presence of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image. It's going to tell us that as these things progress, it will be given that he provides that no one will be able to buy or to sell except the one who has the mark, either the name of the beast or the number of his name. I mean, we live in such a time, right, when we've watched, and I often had incredible conversations with my grandmother, because to me it was fascinating, a generation that watched going from literally horse and buggy and a sleigh over the snow where they would get into town in Manitoba in the wintertime, to, you know, debit cards, computers, right? You just think of that incredible transition in their lifespan. You think of all the things that we're told and how close we are, right? You just think that, like, even look at today, the decisions that are being made all around us, right? Reading an article on fraud today, that we've gone from a credit card that you magnetically swipe to a chip in the card that you can tap. And now the problem with fraud is that it's increasing, not decreasing. And so the next step is to make the biometric step, where the chip is no longer in a card, but in your hand, right? That you can just wave. Like, all these things are steps closer and closer. But should we be surprised? What we need prayer for, because we know where things are going. The real prayer is today, just as we prayed this morning, how are we as the church to respond? How are we to respond? We know it shouldn't surprise us where it's going. God's already foretold. But how do we as a church today respond to where it's going? I'm going to give you an example as a farmer, because, and I want to make sure I'm not giving you a political point of view, or I'm not trying to tear down a political party or promote a political party, but there's things in our lives where we're constantly having to make some choices. And this came to light recently. As farmers, we live in something called the ALR, the Agriculture Land Reserve. And there's all kinds of rules that revolve around when you live on ALR land, right? It has to be used primarily for agricultural use. Okay, so I can't just put up a hotel on it if I wanted to. I couldn't subdivide it if I wanted to. There's rules that well, always the rules had been that you can have a second dwelling on ALR land, right? And up until last year, that second dwelling had to be mobile. It had either to be moved on or on a movable foundation. It could only house a farm worker or a blood relative. It couldn't be a rental unit or anything like that. There were all kinds of things. Well, up until last year, that was the law. And all of a sudden they began to change the laws, right? And any of you who may have followed them, it was like first a decision comes down, and if we wanted to apply for a building permit to put a second dwelling, oh, I'm sorry, now you need to show me that you have enough income to provide a salary for a farm worker before you're allowed to build for that farm worker. And so you might say, well, we can't be big enough to make money to provide until, oh no, sorry, you've got to have the money before. You can't have the house and the farm worker before the money. And so things started to change. And then another law would come down, and another law. And then all of a sudden it became, yeah, we've done some thinking, and no more second dwelling on ALR land. Doesn't matter, farm worker or blood relative, it's out. And I don't know if you heard about it. There were some big things going on. Some hit the news, some didn't, but in the farm community, a lot of undercurrent. This is where I told you sometimes I was in meeting halls that were like movie picturesque of farmers yelling at a politician in a suit in an old community hall. It was wild because in one decision, we felt they made a new rule or got rid of an old rule. And now, without being able to build a second dwelling, now they've killed multi-generational farming, right? Because I can never afford to hand down my farm to my kid because everything I own is wrapped up in the farm. Where am I going to live if I hand it over? I've got to sell this place to buy a new place if I ever had to. So in one decision, multi-generational farming, dead, because I'll never afford a second dwelling and I can't hand down to my children as I get older. 2, if we had any thoughts of caring for our parents in their elderly age, well, now we've added to the healthcare crisis because now I can't even have a home here to take care of my family, even if I wanted to. Do you know what I mean? So now they can't live here either. And all of a sudden, it's like, it seems like these bungled decisions are making a mess of things and creating more problems than good and making it harder and harder to farm the land. Now, I'm saying all this to tell you this, and that was with the lady who owned our farm. She's involved politically, head of the Coombs Farm Institute. She goes to Victoria and meets with the MPs. Well, as she does all of this and tries to defend small farmers' rights, she's an incredible woman that does a lot of work on behalf of agriculture. In all of her working and studying and interacting, she turns over a paper one day, and it was a position paper by one of the backbenchers that sets government policy. And in this paper is a clear outline how the best way forward for the government is for the government to own all ALR land. And you're like, do you know what I mean? And again, I want to make sure this isn't a political thing right now. I'm just giving you an example because you guys know kind of my church side of life. These are things going on the farm side of life. And it's like all of a sudden, all of the politicians at the front of the room going, oh, sorry, we didn't intend for that to happen. And we didn't intend for that. Oh, we didn't realize that was going to be the outcome of that decision. And oh, I'm sorry. And all of a sudden you realize behind it all was what? An agenda that was moving in a direction to gain control and take the freedom. And so now all of a sudden we're put in the position of, how do you respond? Do you go to the community hall and yell at the politician? Entertaining, yes. Does it do much? Not usually, in my experience. Is it time to drive my tractor over the Malahat to Victoria and park it on the front lawn? It's happened before, right? Not me, but there was a parade of tractors one year not too long ago. Is it time to drive my John Deere over the hump and park on the lawn and protest? Or is it time for me to carry on and obey, give to Caesar what is Caesar, and maintain a testimony within the system, continue the conversation, and walk within what's going on versus shout and fight and stamp my feet about what's going on. And I'm going to share all of that because there's the decision platform. How do I respond? Now, why do I share all of that? Because we know where the world is going. We know what's happening. We know that there's an agenda being driven. And in this world, not to God, but what did we read this morning? That this mystery of lawlessness is already at work, and only what God has left to restrain is going to stay until God pulls off the restraint. The question we have today is, how do I respond? And today, how do we not end up being those finding ourselves agreeing with what we shouldn't agree with, supporting or doing what we shouldn't be doing, or following who we shouldn't follow? Here's the thing. Today, we need to follow the voice of the Good Shepherd unrelentingly, undistracted. And here's the biggest distraction I find today. And I'm going to map over here. And I hope you guys are following me this morning, because I'm a bit of a jumble, but I hope it comes clear by the end. We need to be so set on the Lord's voice, and we cannot be distracted today by what God says to my neighbor versus what God says to me. And I'm going to give you an example in two ways. Okay. And we're going to map to some verses that we talked about in our last Bible study together, before the last one was upended by my misbehaving automobile. But it says, as we read, and I'm going to read for you guys in Romans 14 and verse 1. And then I'm going to map to some verses in the Old Testament. And we read this at our Bible study a couple weeks ago. Romans 14 verse 1 says this: "Now accept the one who is weak in faith, but not for the purpose of passing judgment on his opinions. One person has faith that he may eat all things, but he who is weak eats vegetables only. The one who eats is not regarded with contempt for the one who does not eat, and the one who does not eat is not to judge the one who eats, for God has accepted him. Who are you to judge the servant of another? To his own master he stands or falls, and he will stand, for the Lord is able to make him stand. One person regards one day above another, another regards every day alike. Each person must be fully convinced in his own mind. He who observes, observes the day, observes it for the Lord, and he who eats does so for the Lord. And he gives thanks to God, and he who eats not, for the Lord does not eat, and gives thanks to God. For not one of us lives for himself, and not one dies for himself. For if we live for the Lord. If we die for the Lord. Therefore, whether we live or die, we are the Lord's. For to this end Christ died and lived again, that he might be the Lord of both the dead and the living. But you, why do you judge your brother? Or you again, why do you regard your brother with contempt? For we will all stand before the judgment seat of God." Now I want to stop there, because in Romans 14, and for those who are with us in Bible study, we were talking about the fact that we stand before the Lord and must walk in the full conviction of our faith in the Lord. But here's the great distraction. Romans 14 says, listen, if by faith you walk and you are troubled by the eating of meat, things sacrificed to idols, don't eat. But if you know with all your heart that it is okay to eat the meat, go ahead, eat the meat. But here's the grand issue he speaks of, that we judge one another. Do you know what happens in my walk? I get sidetracked. And here's the sidetrack. Rather than being a vessel who's pointing people to Christ, and let's say we had that issue in our midst today. Some people had come out of a faith system that involves sacrificing meat to foreign idols, and that meat had the connotation to them of idol worship, and they did not want to ever eat meat again. And there was another group in our church that felt the freedom to eat that meat. And by God's word, they have the freedom because it's okay. Rather than becoming a vessel of encouragement to God and to Christ, you know what happens? I get sidetracked and distracted by my endeavor now, not only to lead you to Christ, but if I'm a meat eater, it becomes my sole purpose to tell you that you're not truly living the Christian life until you've tasted the meat. Oh, I want you to know Jesus. But my sole purpose today is to tell you that you can be free and eat the meat. Or my sole purpose becomes, if I don't want to eat the meat, hey, listen here, you're a compromiser. Don't eat the meat. Hey, don't eat them. And eating or not eating the meat becomes on par with the gospel of the salvation of Jesus. And my sole focus becomes about the meat, eating or not, and not the love of Christ. Why am I bringing that into all of this? Because today, we're walking in a time where we must be so sensitive to the voice of the Lord. And we must walk by faith, pure conviction. And I'll tell you about the distraction. I had a friend come over today, and often as we're discussing and chatting, things come up about what's happening in the community around us. And here's the comment I heard today. And not today, but just recently, and it made me laugh and cry at the same time. Are you guys meeting as a church yet? I said, no, we're still meeting online. Oh, sheeple. That's what he called us, sheeple, okay? Oh, easily led, you sheeple. We're meeting in our living room. And we have people over all the time. You've missed it, right? In his mind, compromiser, weak, sheeple, easily led to the slaughter, right? And here's me pushing back. Oh, we found a greater testimony. You know, we found a greater communion and communication during this time that we actually have learned from and want to add to our personal service. Like we've actually found things during this time that we don't want to let go of. And you know, and I can bring up another argument and another side. And I told you guys recently, we had someone come over, one of the workers who happened to be a personal friend of Pastor Coates. And I find when Pastor Coates come up, it's are you for him or against him? Are you going to go to prison too? Or are you one of those weak churches that's going to pretend nothing's happening? And you know where this all brought me? And I really hope this rat's nest that's up here comes clear by the end, because there's like a lump of spaghetti right here. Here's where it brought me, the book of Daniel. Why? Not maybe where you think, end times. No, beginning of the book of Daniel, and a time in which God called 4 men, one named Daniel, the others would go by the names Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You know what struck me by that this week? That when we begin to read Daniel in chapter 1, and again, for time's sake, I can't read it all for you. They're brought before the king, Nebuchadnezzar, and these wise men and youth, which had no defect, showing intelligence, every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding, they were brought into the king's order. And the 4 are named together 7 times in chapter 1. It was there that when they were going to be offered the meat, Daniel said, no, we don't want to defile ourselves. That should give you a pinpoint of Daniel's heart. Okay? We don't want to defile ourselves with the king's choice food. Give us vegetables. And he trusted the Lord so much that he said in Daniel chapter 1, watch us for 10 days. And if our faces look shallow or weak, then we'll talk about it. But by the God's grace, the person overseeing them gave them vegetables, and they looked as healthy and well as all the rest. What was our discussion earlier in this message? There's one check for the vegetarian line, okay? I'm a beef farmer. I'll give you some checks for the beef farmer line afterwards. But listen, it goes on, and they're mentioned together, and how then Daniel is going to share about the king's dream, right? It's in Daniel 2, verse 1. In the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, he had dreams, and his spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. The king gave orders to call in the magicians, the conjurers, the sorcerers, the Chaldeans, to tell the king his dreams. And they came in and stood before the king. And he told them his dream. His spirit was anxious to understand. But when nobody could give an interpretation of the dream, in Daniel 2:13, it said, the decree went forth that the wise men should be slain. And they looked for Daniel and his friends to kill them. Always a unit of 4, right? Daniel and his friends, they were all ready to be killed. Daniel replied with discretion, discernment. He said to the king, what reason is the decree from the king so urgent? Daniel went in request of the king. He would give him time in order that he might declare the interpretation to the king. And it's a beautiful story, because here Daniel and his friends all go before the Lord. And here's the prayer. Daniel said, let the name of God be blessed forever and ever, for wisdom and power belong to him. It is he who changes the times, the epochs. He removes kings and establishes kings. He gives wisdom to wise men and knowledge to men of understanding. It is he who reveals the profound and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and power. Even now you've made known to me what we requested of you, for you've made known to us the king's matter. Isn't that great? He prays, he gives thanks. God gives him understanding. And after he goes in and he tells the king the meaning of the dream, Daniel 3, verse 28, Nebuchadnezzar would respond, and they'd all get put, rather, not Daniel 3 yet, over Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were going to be over areas of the country. Daniel was going to be put in a higher place. Here's what's striking. When it gets to Daniel chapter 3 and the story, for those of us who've been to Sunday school, we all know about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the great idol that Nebuchadnezzar would raise, the fiery furnace. Here's something you don't read about in all of chapter 3, Daniel. Where's he when all this is going down? The 3 friends are brought. It's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego who don't bow. And you know what? Just like all good Christian literature, as soon as there's something we don't know, you can buy volumes at the local Christian bookstore. Some say Daniel bowed down and he learned confidence when he saw that his friends didn't burn up, and that's what led to him having confidence at the lion's den. You can read that Daniel was somewhere far away, and you know what? We don't know. But here's what we do know. In that moment, at that time, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had a decision to make. Am I going to bow, or am I going to stand? Daniel's journey, that wasn't his moment or mark in time, was it? Whatever he was doing, wherever he was, and we know by his first decision, he wouldn't even eat the king's meat because he didn't want to defile himself. That was Daniel's heart. So if you think he bowed, I would say, no, I don't think so. But you know what? That Daniel, he continued to serve, and he was serving faithfully. And when it was Nebuchadnezzar, read on the next 3 chapters of Daniel. He served Nebuchadnezzar, who then would go on to have a dream, and God would show him a tree that was going to be cut down. And Daniel was there to share the dream. And after Nebuchadnezzar, it was his son. And his son would have a hand show up on the wall when he would start to drink. It says his wives, his concubines, they brought out the Lord's things from the temple, and they all drank from it and worshiped the gods of gold and silver. And a hand showed up and started to write on the wall, and nobody could share what the words said until they sought out Daniel. There he was again. Oh, and when you read on, right, there he was for Nebuchadnezzar's son. On it would go until chapter 6, when God, after having told him what was going to happen, with the writing on the wall, it was at the end of chapter 5 that Daniel would be there now when the Medes and the Persians were going to come and overthrow Nebuchadnezzar's son. And here's Daniel still serving. Oh, Daniel's time would come, because in chapter 6, what's going to happen? The decree for the lion's den, right? For all who would not worship the king. But it's easy for us to say those words, aren't they? Where were you? Daniel, where were you when it was our time to stand at the idol? Off somewhere making decisions, serving. Daniel, why didn't you put on the placard of protest after that? Why didn't you run away after that? Why didn't you still serving? His time to stand would come. But he had to be faithful to the role, the place, and the time that God had given him. He was going to be preserved for a testimony later, not just to the line of Nebuchadnezzar, but Daniel was going to be preserved in a role and a place to the line of the Medes and the Persians, the kingdom come after. You know, I see this often when we look at our New Testament, and you have to laugh and wonder, how did they know? Because there was a time when the gates blew open, and we've talked about this before. The gates blow open, and when the guard is about to fall on his sword and commit suicide because he thought he lost all the prisoners, there they are, singing hymns in the prison. They've sat still. There's another time when the gates blow open, and an angel comes and says, get up, it's time to go. Let's run. There's a time to flee. There's a time to be stoned. There's a time to stand, a time to proclaim, a time, as we read in Thessalonians, to lead a quiet life and live as a testimony. I love the fact that as you go through the Old Testament, it seems as though there was always a voice, a godly voice, that had access to the temple courts. Isaiah came in and out of those courts of the king. Daniel was there, right? Joseph to the kingship of the when it was Egypt, right? And the Pharaoh. I mean, God kept bringing a testimony and sustaining a testimony to those who were leading. So are we at a place and position today where when we see someone like Pastor Coates, who's been greatly debated, one, we can say today, I support him. I support his fight. I support the longing to know freedom. I support his stand, because it is important that we as the body can meet together, and we want to meet together. But today, his stand doesn't dictate my action. My action today is dictated by what God has called me to do today, here, now, this community. By faith I walk. the next instruction. God, what is my stand today? What have you called us to? I need to be faithful to the instruction now, fully, confidently. And I don't want to blindly follow what someone else has said. I don't disregard what they've said, but it doesn't mean I follow into action what they've said, because I need to have wisdom in where God has brought me now as a testimony in this community. I come full circle to Dietrich Bonhoeffer and the confessing church. There was a time to live in England and write and give out information about what was going on inside the country that people didn't know or people didn't understand because of all the misinformation. There was a time to stand outside the country, but there was a turning point where he knew, even though he might be going to his own imprisonment, that there was a time for him to go back in and be a testimony in the country. He could have stayed in the comforts of a seminary in England, but there was a divine conviction that he needed to go back in. Today, are we sensitive to the time and the timing of the Lord? Today, what has God called us as a community to do? How to live, how to walk, how to serve? When they accuse Paul, and I love the verbiage in the New International Version, because the New International Version, because there, Paul says this: I do not dare compare myself with those who compare themselves with themselves. I am not going to use those who make themselves the standard, my standard. My standard is obedience to Christ and Christ alone. So how do we as a community support the fight for freedom? Support the fight for our right, and yet at the same time, wholeheartedly, uncompromisingly follow the next direction and dictation from God and God alone. Not what are they doing? What are we doing? What's the testimony in this community that God has for us today? Today, has he called me to drive my tractor to Victoria? Or is it to walk by obedience? And I'll tell you, I'm just giving you the tip of the iceberg. I could give you so many, right? One of our favorites last year was, if I dig a hole in the ground, the water I collect is my water. Just like if you put a barrel under your eaves trough on your house. But the moment I dig a hole, that water is my water. The moment that hole overflows, and the overflow of that water makes its way to a public ditch, a creek, or any kind of waterway, now all the water in the hole belongs to the province of British Columbia. And now I have to buy a permit to use the water in the hole that I dug. And if my cows take one lick of the water, it's a commercial permit to use the water. They own all the water. And then they want to come and make me show them all the things of water. And I'll tell you, the discussion is ongoing. Do I let them on my property? Do I tell them about all the wells? Do I tell them about all the holes collecting water in the ground? Do I hide the holes in the ground? Do you know what I mean? Oh, the discussions go on. And there's some farmers who feel called to fight. There's some who are driving their tractors in Victoria, and there's some who've maintained a testimony in the farming community and still have a voice with the leaders of the province and those in government, because they've chosen to today, even though they disagree with them, follow the rules, because today that's their call. They're going to continue on in integrity and keep the seat at the table. Some would say they're playing chess, not checkers. They're waiting for the time, the place, the moment to speak into it, because they've gained the credibility that they're not just a loud voice against the government, they're working with the government. Do you see? I'm giving that as an example to say, Wow, today we are met with incredible spiritual. The world is going in a direction. God has said that's Second Thessalonians 2. This is where we're going. The spirit of lawlessness is at work. We are in the end times. Never been closer. Can say that every day. But today I don't just do what my neighbors are doing. I do what God has called us to do in this moment. And as a community, that's what we need to hold on to. So we could ask a couple questions today. One, have I ever found myself distracted, making the importance rather than the love of Jesus, the bringing people to Jesus, trying to bring people to that theological point of view over Jesus? Listen, you don't really know him until you've eaten the meat or haven't eaten the meat. Have I become distracted by being a judge of others rather than a signpost for others to the Lord who judges? Easy to be distracted. Two, have I gotten distracted by looking at others' journey? Where was Daniel when they were there? Why wasn't he in the furnace too? Did he bow? Was he, what could have been more important than at that moment? No, God had him somewhere else. That wasn't his time. That wasn't his place. God was preserving him for another thing. He was going to obediently follow along. And while he probably wasn't there, wherever he was, God was preserving for a testimony at a later time to a later kingdom. You can't judge Daniel, who wasn't there, but what you think he did or didn't do. God had him on a different path. Thirdly, what has God told us to do today? As we're now going to be given the freedom to start meeting together, how are we going to use that freedom? How are we going to take those next steps? Again, remembering that of the utmost importance, the testimony of Jesus. That's what we're after. That he might be glorified. Or have I ever gotten caught just following the crowd, doing what they're doing, rather than waiting on and listening for the Lord's voice as to what to do next? So important. That's a jumble of thoughts that I hope in some form, way, shape, all come together to challenge you as the Lord's been challenging me. I need to know God's thoughts. I need to walk in faith, in full conviction as to what his direction is. This is how we break the cycle of carrying on. How did we start today's service? Abuses that went on that shouldn't have gone on. Someone should have seen, someone should have known, someone should have stepped up and done differently. How is that possible? They weren't listening, right? Too busy making people into the form and format they wanted to be godly and not listening to God. Trying to crush people instead of knowing the love of God for these people. Today, are we listening in these end times? Never a moment more important than now that we know how to respond. And we can encourage those who in this moment are on a platform standing up to the government, can't we? Because if there are voice pieces and places to do so. And we can equally lead a quiet life and follow the Lord if this is our time. This is our testimony to this community that he's placed us in. Today, we live before the Lord, who is Lord over the living and the dead. And whether we live or die, we live or die for him. What's he called us to today? There's the challenge. And as always, God's challenging me in so many ways. Love to hear your thoughts. We are going to go into a time of communion, of course, in which we'll proclaim the Lord laying down his life, as we read. But I highlight the end of that chapter, Romans 14, verse 23. I don't have any tattoos, but if I did get one, that might be one of them. Whatever is not from faith is sin. That's how that chapter ends. And whatever is not from faith is sin. What does that tell you? That today God longs for dependence. You can give all your money to the poor and still have missed it, because whatever is not from faith is sin. You can try and push, mold, shape, or conform people into his image and have converts to speak of and boast of. And yet, if it did not involve faith, it is sin. You missed the mark God has for you. You can speak messages. You can hand out tracts. You can lay down your life on the line. And yet, whatever is not from faith is sin. Today, who's our standard? Who are we following? I pray the Lord alone, his example, his instruction, because he's the God who not only instills his will in our hearts, he's the God who wants to bring it to pass. That's whom we serve.